What is up? We are back in action. We're going to pick up right where we left off, the impact of the Civil War on democracy, and we are going to move on to what is known as Reconstruction. So let's go jump into it. The impact of the Civil War on democracy. So number one, it preserved the Union while liberating an enslaved minority. Okay, so that was a really big deal. Number two, the federal courts ruled secession to be null and void. Okay. Number three, the ideas of states' rights upon which secession was based was never defeated. Later emerged in the Civil Rights era. And number four, the 13th Amendment in 1865 would abolish slavery and freedom would be formally legalized. Okay, and so number four is probably the biggest one. We get the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery. Okay, and so there would be no more slavery. Anybody who was slaves would now be free. This would be a big deal. Okay, so moving on. Reconstruction. So basically, Civil War leaves the United States in shambles. So we have got to reconstruct the Union. So that's why this period is called the Reconstruction era. All right. And so the Civil War ends. And so the question is, how will the CSA states rejoin the Union? All right. So how are we going to let these states that seceded, that left the Union, that said, hey, screw you guys, we're doing our own thing, how are you going to let them back in? And so the Republican Party, there also were radical Republicans. They believe that Confederates committed crimes and should be punished. All right. And so they fought for full citizenship of African Americans. And so, this would be this was a very big issue, kind of getting the nation back on track, getting these states who once left, back into the Union. So following the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. All right, and so his vice president, Andrew Johnson, would become president in 1865 and kind of take over for him. So let's look at some the plans. So there are three plans for Reconstruction. There was Abraham Lincoln's plan, there's Andrew Johnson's plan, and there was the Radical Republicans' plan, gave by Thaddeus Stevens, who was a representative from Pennsylvania, and also a very radical Republican. So Abraham Lincoln's plan was called the 10% plan. Basically, it said if 10% of a rebel state's voters swore loyalty to the Union, that state could create a new government. And if that state then created a new constitution that abolished slavery, they would regain representation in Congress. So basically saying, hey, if 10% of the people in a Confederate state said, hey, we want to be loyal to the Union, then that would make them create a new government. And when that new government, if they abolished slavery, then they could gain representation in Congress. Easy fix, easy way back in, no harm done. Okay, kind of full, just repentance type deal. No harm foul, all that good stuff. The radical Republicans said, no way, Jose. They said that's dumb. That's way too easy on them, and they passed what is known as the Wade-Davis bill. Okay, and so this would say that the majority of states' voters had to swear loyalty. Okay, and it required guarantees of African American equality. Okay, and so these are two button heads already. Then Andrew Johnson, he comes with a plan because he becomes president, and his plan was one, he offered pardons to the Confederates and who that swore allegiance to the Union. Okay, so those who were part of the Confederacy, if they wanted to rejoin the Union and to swear allegiance to them, they would be given a pardon or an excuse for their wrongdoing. All right, so then each state was then required to ratify or officially approve or accept the 13th Amendment, which would be to abolish slavery, and they could rejoin the Union. And three, wealthy plantation owners were required to personally ask Johnson for a pardon. Okay, and many states would actually meet Johnson's requirements, but those states still tried to limit the rights and liberties of African Americans by, number one, restricting voting rights to white men only, and number two, creating black codes, which were laws that limited the rights of African Americans. So Confederate states would abolish slavery, but they would make life on African Americans very, very hard and difficult. Kind of out of bitterness and out of spite and stuff like that. So then we get past the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that banned any state legislation that limited civil rights of African Americans. So Andrew Johnson basically says, hey, this is enough. We can't have this. You cannot create any state legislation that will limit the civil rights of African Americans. So then we had the Freedmen's Bureau Act in 1865 and 1866. Okay, this basically was a government agency that provided services in support of the freed slaves. Okay, that's why it's called the Freedmen's Bureau Act. Freedmen, like free men. Okay, the Freedmen Bureaus Act, a government agency to provide services to support the freed slaves. The Radical Republicans' plan passed the 14th Amendment. Okay, so this guaranteed equality under the law for all citizens. Persons born and naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. Okay, and so it basically guarantees citizenships to African Americans. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 would then abolish governments in the former CSA states. It divided the South into 5 military districts to allow the Union troops to enforce Reconstruction. And then it set up readmission requirements to the Union. They had to, and in those, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Then also passed the 15th Amendment, which then would guarantee voting rights to African Americans. And that basically says no state can deny a citizen the right to vote on the grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Okay? And so, but really it says citizens really mean men, okay, because women were still not given the right to vote regardless. And so by 1870, all former Confederate states met the requirements under radical Reconstruction and rejoined the Union. And the Republican Party became the dominant political force in the government of these former Confederate states. Okay, and so the South was kind of able to, in a way, join back and rejoin the Union. And so in the Reconstruction era, the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. And many former Confederate states had African American elected officials, and the Republican Party would then would be strengthened. Okay, and so then we have a political shift started to happen. One, we had carpetbaggers. These were Northern Republicans. They were either missionaries or teachers or entrepreneurs. They would move down south post-war. They're called carpetbaggers because they would take their stuff with them in a carpet bag. Okay. Then you had scallywags, which was a white Southerners that didn't participate in the CSA. And they supported Republican views on economic growth in public schools. Okay, and so scallywags were the white Southerners, but they were not in favor of what the South did during slavery. And so look at some of the economies. So following the Civil War, the South was largely populated by landless people. 90% of all farmland was owned by the wealthy minority. And so millions of white Southerners and freedmen were competing for jobs on farms. And so we see that through Reconstruction, the South's economy was kind of in shambles because they didn't really know what to do. People were all fighting for jobs, and money was not being made as much. And it was a big grand old mess. So here's some of the solutions for that. One, we had sharecropping. And so sharecropping was when landowners dictated the crop, provide shelter and tools for the sharecropper, and landowner would get a share of the crop's harvest. Okay. Then you had shared tenancy, where the farm worker chose the crops and used their own supplies, but the landowner got a share of the crops. And then you had tenant farming, where the tenant would pay cash to rent land and would do whatever they want to, but they just have to pay the landowner land. So those were 3 solutions used for kind of helping out this problem in the South, trying to help those out with their with this issue of who's getting money, who's not getting money, and things like that. So sharecropping, shared tenancy, and tenant farming. And so looking at the rise of political and racial discrimination. And so African Americans continue to gain political power. They're standing they're able to gain political power or standing, but hostile white Southerners would organize methods to deter them. One was the Ku Klux Klan, which was established in 1866. This was the most widely known. And the goals were to intimidate African Americans and scare them away from voting polls, use violent threats, etc. You've probably seen pictures of the Ku Klux Klan and the guys who wear the white robes with the giant cones like ghosts, whatever else. They burn crosses, blah, blah, blah. That is the Ku Klux Klan. If you've seen Django, there's that one scene where they weren't actually, I don't know the Ku Klux Klan then, but they put the bed sheets over their faces. He had a really funny scene or whatever else where they got complained about the bed sheets. But it's somewhat similar to that, but never mind. I'm getting off track. But Ku Klux Klan was created to intimidate African Americans and scare them away from the voting polls. And so Congress would respond to racial violence with the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. And the federal offense, this was a federal offense to interfere with citizens' right to vote. So it made it basically illegal for the Ku Klux Klan to do what they were doing to interfere with other citizens trying to vote. And so looking at more discrimination, you had during the 1870s, there was an additional effort made by white Southerners to regain political power. And so you have what was known as redeemers. These were politicians who wanted to return to the South